Juan Mendez Scott's The Guest Room. Chapter 11. The Goodbye Gathering. We were all at my parents' house that evening. They lived in the beautiful, quiet, historic Broad Creek and Battersea neighborhood in Fort Washington, in a 5-bedroom colonial, the same house my brother and I grew up in. The familiar scent of blooming azaleas and the distant hum of crickets filled the air. Inside, the mood was heavy with grief. Mom and Dad sat sad and quiet, saying nothing. Preston's parents were there too, both looking wrecked with the loss of their son. Mrs. Taylor was there also, her presence a constant comfort since the deadly sinkhole. She'd been by my side through it all. I had gone to talk to Liana's mother and stepfather at their house in Mitchellville, Maryland. They both walked around like crying zombies, their eyes hollow and red. County official Mel Patterson and PG County Fire Chief Robert Mark came to my parents' house to talk to me. The living room, usually filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a tomb. I faced them and asked, "So will they ever be found?" All heads turned to Mr. Patterson. He slightly shook his head, tightening his mouth. He wanted to give us good news so badly, but there was no good news. Mel Patterson, in his mid-40s, was of normal height, muscular, and tight in his uniform. His short, gray hair was all over the place, looking as though he was about to fall asleep on somebody's shoulder at any moment. The landslide and sinkhole had worn him out. "No, Mrs. Osborn," he said. They will never be found." Preston's mother stood. She was trembling and a little wobbly, about to panic. "Never be found? How is that? You have to find him," she cried. Mrs. Osborn was a tall, plain Jane with soft, shoulder-length hair. She wore a bandaged walking boot from an ankle sprain caused when she learned of the deadly sinkhole. And she was as feisty as a nasty joke. "That sinkhole was estimated at 20 feet across," Mr. Patterson said. "And 20 feet deep. It caused your home's concrete floor to cave in." "I heard it when it caved in," I said. "Me and Mrs. Taylor both." Chief Mark asked, "What did it sound like?" "It was a loud crash," I said. "Sounded like a car hitting the house." Preston's mother walked over and faced Chief Mark, fresh tears in her eyes. "So you have no answers to what happened to our son?" Chief Mark sighed and shook his head, unable to find any words to comfort Mrs. Osborn. "I'm sorry I can't hear you," he said softly. "That's the best way we can put it to you, Mrs. Osborn," Chief Mark said. "Our equipment did not pick up any signs of life." Chief Robert Mark, in his late 40s, was a short, serious man who looked you dead in the face when he spoke. He sported an afro that reminded me of one of the members of Earth, Wind and Fire. When his cell rang, it always played music from the 50s, especially Little Bitty Pretty One. My mother-in-law gave both Chief Mark and Mr. Patterson hateful glares. "This is not what this little gathering here should be about." "I'm sure they did the best they could," my mom said, looking so sad, feeling bad for the Osborns. My mom, 51, was a short, stylish woman and as alluring as a magnet and as cheerful as a cheerleader. After my younger brother and I grew up and moved out of the house, most of her time was spent on karaoke and watching Oprah's own network. "But they're not doing anything right now," Mrs. Osborn said, raising her voice. "It's nothing else they can do," my dad said. Dad sounded like he was pleading with the Osborns to have some sort of understanding of what was going on, seeing the reality of the situation. But the Osborns lost their son. They didn't give a damn about seeing the reality side of it. Their son, buried and gone forever, wasn't coming back. My dad, 55 years old, was a short, solid Azarok wild man who loved to hunt, with corpse-gray eyes. That's where I got my funny-colored eyes from him. His hardness came from being in the Marines. This sinkhole had his nerves bad though. It reminded him of the horrible train crash he was in as a child, where he lost 3 of his closest cousins, all boys. They were on their way to my great-grandmother's house in North Carolina for the summer. "No, I don't want to hear that," Mrs. Osborn said, raising her voice, quiet tears streaming. "And this is not what this little gathering should be about. It should be about searching for human beings, not standing here talking about it. Now we have to get my son out of that hole." Mr. Osborn watched his wife, looking so pitiful. How when they said, he began. How? Mrs. Osborn demanded, yelling. What do you mean how? Damit, they. He needs to get out of there. We need to get him out of there. Mrs. Osborn was about to break down, to a point where Mr. Osborn had to get up and try and calm her down. Mr. Osborn, in his early 50s, was a short, small man with small teeth. Even his hair was short but soft, like Preston's was. What I remember most about my father-in-law was that he was always flirting and winking at women at his big money cookouts, all the while grilling and getting drunk. At least so that they can have a proper burial, Mrs. Osborn said. Let's pray he's stuck in an air pocket and not suffocated, my mom said, hope in her tone. Well, there was soil poured into the hole already, Mr. Patterson said, his voice low and drifting. It was the way Mrs. Osborn looked at the fire chief and county official. I thought she was about to grab a butcher knife from the kitchen and slice them up into tiny pieces. Mrs. Osborn started pacing, massaging her forehead with the tips of her fingers. Why would you pour soil on top of my son and that girl when you haven't even gotten them out yet? Oh my God, what is this? Like I said, ma'am, and I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson said. Again, I'm sorry. But there is. I don't want to hear that, Mrs. Osborn said. I'm tired of hearing you people say you're sorry. I want to hear when you're going back into that hole, Mr. Patterson said. And as I was saying, it is nothing else we can do. There's nothing else that could be done. Mrs. Osborn was about to lose her mind. Mr. Osborn grabbed her and just held her, trying to calm her down. But of course, calming her down was way out of the question. Then Mrs. Osborn turned to me. She looked me dead in the eyes, and it stung a little bit, catching me off guard. Someone's responsible for this. As I've said in the news conference the other night, Mr. Patterson said to me, as sympathetically as he could, your home, Mrs. Osborn, is seriously unstable. No one can go in your home. No one. I looked at Mr. Patterson. Well, when can I go back in my home? Yes. Mr. Patterson looked at me, his face cold and blank. Not ever. I continued looking at Mr. Patterson, waiting for him to come up with a solution I was never going to get. As in never again. Yes. As in never again, that is correct. For a moment it was so quiet I thought I lost my hearing. Going back into that house is the only way we can get my son, Mrs. Osborn said, voice cracking, pleading. My dad said, why can't my daughter go back into her home? Because we're afraid of another collapse, Mr. Patterson said. And losing more lives. Mr. Patterson and Chief Mark were getting to a point where they were not going to spare any feelings. No one could go near that hole. That house. My house. Period. And that Preston and Liana were gone. Forever. Mrs. Osborn cried harder now. Well, that's just the chance you'll have to take. You all need to get back in there. Please. Mr. Patterson just watched her cry, giving her a moment. Mrs. Osborn. The soil around the home is very soft. And that sinkhole is expected to grow. Matter of fact, it's going to grow. It's growing as we speak. I wasn't intending on staying in my house anyway. The fear alone of falling into a sinkhole and being buried alive would have driven me insane. My dad said, so what's next? Besides filling the hole. Engineers are saying they may have to demolish the house, Mr. Patterson said. Even though from the outside there appears to be nothing wrong with your house. Or the concrete wall structure of it. Everything looks fine from the outside. But the more that sinkhole spreads, the more the chance your house is going to be sucked up by it. How old is the house? Asked Chief Mark. It was built in 1974, I said. Over 40 years ago. My dad said, sinkholes like that. They're not common in this area or region. Right. In Florida mostly, Mr. Patterson said, nodding. That's what I thought, Dad said. Florida is highly prone to sinkholes because there are caverns below ground of limestone, Mr. Patterson said. Dad said, limestone. Yep, Mr. Patterson said. What's limestone? My mom asked. Limestone is a porous rock that easily dissolves in water, Chief Mark said. And Florida is just sitting on all that. My God, Mom said, shaking her head at the awful thought of it. They had a sinkhole near Orlando that grew to 400 feet, Chief Mark said. When was this? Ed asked. Recently. 1981, Chief Mark said. It claimed 5 cars, 2 businesses, and a 3-bedroom house. Damn, Dad said, frowning and shaking his head. More than 500 sinkholes have been reported in Hillsborough County, Florida alone, Mr. Patterson said, since the government started keeping track of them in the 1950s. According to the state's environmental agency. That's a lot of sinkholes. Yes, it is, Dad said. I've been here all my life, Mrs. Taylor said. I've just never heard of anything like this. Not in this area. Right, my dad said. Neither have I. There have been sinkholes in D.C. that I do know of, Mr. Patterson said. The biggest one I can think of being about 8, 9, 10 feet. Dad said, oh yeah. Where? In Northeast D.C. Mrs. Osborn started yelling. All this talk about sinkholes in Florida and Northeast D.C. What about the one in Fort Washington, in Piscataway Hills? What about that one? Everyone was speechless for a moment, praying she would finally calm down. I said, Mrs. Osborn, I know this is hard. I need you all to get my son out of that hole. Again, trying to calm his wife, Mr. Osborn said, listen to me. No, I want him out. My God, Mom said, standing. She wanted to help Mrs. Osborn so badly, but like the rest of us, she didn't know what to say. Mr. Osborn grabbed and held his wife. Listen to me. It is nothing we can do. Mrs. Osborn said, pleading, crying. We can dig him out. Baby, no we can't. We need to dig him out. To give him a decent burial. I know he was wrong for going to bed with that girl. I know he was wrong, but he needs to be dug out. So that I can give my son a proper funeral and burial. Still we were all speechless. What could we say? She had every right to want her son out of that bottomless, eternal hole. Mr. Osborn faced her, with tears in his eyes, lips quivering. He held her hands, shaking them with a gentle touch to settle her. Mrs. Osborn was not going to surrender to the reality of the horror of that sinkhole. So Mr. Osborn was going to give her a hard dose of reality. He had no other choice but to. And he was the only one that could do it because Preston was his son too. He looked into his wife's eyes with no more sympathy, just cold reality. That's the only burial he's going to get, Mr. Osborn said. Him and that girl. That sinkhole is their graves. Mrs. Osborn walked away from her husband, collapsing on the couch, folding up and wailing. There wasn't a dry eye. We all felt her pain. Mr. Osborn sat down beside her and held her in his arms.